My previous video was on the browser shop package, which is a way of automating Chromium browser to print PDF files. So we'd gotten to the point of configuring a users table, associating an authentication token with the user, and then using that token to request a document from the cakephp instance and authenticate to allow that to be printed. However, this users table, if you look at it, the only way really to stop a user logging in is either change the password or authentication token or delete the user. But that's not really what needs to happen. In general, you'd want the ability to mark a user as either active or inactive, or even do the same with a token. So let's have a look at now starting to configure the authentication so that we can do that. So to get started, having a look at the database, we have one user, the admin user, ID1, and there currently is no flag we can set to say the user is active or inactive. So that's our first step. Bake a migration, add active to users, and we say active is Boolean. So once we've done that, we can say cake bake migrations and status, and we're just going to leave the defaults and migrate that migration. So now we can see that it's active 0 because that's the default. But let's have a look at just something that we might want to do if we've made a mistake in a migration. Let's roll back the migration, and it automatically knows that it can delete this column because it's smart enough to know that. It won't always, so you just have to try it and see. But what we can do here is, in our migration, once we've rolled it back, we can say, okay, I didn't want the column to be appended to the end. I want it to be after the ID column. And so once again, we can migrate, have a look at our database schema again, and we can see that the column is where we've specified it. So now, what do we have to do in order to be able to visualize this? Well, if we have a look at our index.php, notice that all we need to do really is just modify it. So let's just copy and paste in. We're going to put active here, and same again for just making sure they're in the right order. Change that to active here. And notice the challenge here when we reload. Notice how active in the database is false, so it's 0, and it's displaying as empty. So one thing you might have to do with this sort of thing is just go, okay, it's a Boolean. If it's true, just say yes, it's active, and if it's not, and you could make that an icon or whatever you like to symbolize it being active. But that then gives you the ability to see that easily. So let's keep going. We've got now we've got a couple of other things. Now we could add an active control to our add action, but we don't want to do that because every user that registers, so to speak, would be marked as active immediately. So we'll leave that alone. We'll put an active control on our edit, and we'll go to our view, and our view is going to need similar treatment to our, I'll just put this here just for the time being. We need to copy that, and then we just need to paste our active. So our view is going to need similar treatment, and notice the view is also using the ID currently, but we don't want that. We want maybe, yeah, the display name to be their email address. So we've now modified our front end so that it picks up the new field. What we need to do also, if we just go to list and have a look at our, and go edit, if I try to set active right at this moment, notice it doesn't select it, and so I'm not going to get continually bothered by update password. I'm just going to go into my edit field and rename this field, because I'm never going to rechange the password. So let's see how we go. That's better. Alright, so notice how even when we set the active field to be the opposite of what it is, it doesn't accept it. And if you've been programming in CakePHP, you'll be well aware of this accessible protected property, _accessible, sorry, in the entity that you're trying to update. Now I could go active and then say true, and that's fine, and that will work. It'll immediately allow me to set that to the opposite of what it should be. But not always do you want to have every form that you submit that permission. You might want to check if there's the right person logged in to be able to make that change. So what we can do, instead of doing that, is we can go to our src users controller, to our edit method, and we'll make a little bit of change. Now, when it talks about when we talk about saving data, we can, when we're assigning the array that's being posted back to the controller, those fields within that _accessible property marked as true, it will accept all the fields in this get data call and assign them into the new entity, and everything will be fine. If it's not in that _accessible property, you won't be able to do that, and that's when you need to rely on accessible fields configuration setting. So firstly, how do we do that? Well, in the patch entity call here, so we've gotten the user out of the database here, then we put the user entity into patch entity, and then we say, okay, overlay that user's data with this new data we're posting in from the form. But this time, what I'd like you to do is, with the active field, which is not set as an accessible field, I'd like you to make a decision based on some Boolean logic. So we'll just leave that as it is. So what do we need to do? We need to say to ourselves, well, I want to get hold of the auth user. And how do we do that? Well, we can use a number of methods. We can go to the request, and we can say get attribute, and then choose the identity attribute. And what will that give us? Well, let's have a look. When we do that, we're going to hit the edit field here. So we just go back and hit edit, and we can see we're getting the authentication identity from this request. So that's the logged in user. So that's one way of getting the logged in user. What's another way of getting the logged in user? Well, another way is by making a call to, and here we see that we should have some auto completion going on, but we don't. So I'm just going to comment that out for a moment and go over to our app controller. Here in our app controller, in the initialize method, we see that we are loading an authentication component from the authentication plugin. So CakePHP does not know about that, or it does, but the VSCode editor doesn't. So what you do, go above the class name and then just specify a class property, and it's from the authentication plugin, and then we're looking for, now components are nested under controller, so what we need to do is then find controller component authentication component and then specify that the property, authentication property, is of this type. So now that we've done that, we can go back and uncomment, and then now as we do this, we'll be able to get the identity that we want to get. So again, if we just call that again, it's exactly the same thing. It's returned our authentication user. Now we can then chain a method off this and get the identifier. Now what's the identifier? It's simply in this case, it's the database ID of that particular user. So it's ID1, which is the admin user. So we could then say to ourselves, okay, now that we've got the auth user ID, we can now come in here and say, okay, if the auth user ID equals, and we'll just hard code this, if it equals the administrator, do the assigning active to the accessible field, so allow the patch, but we also want to say if the user ID equals the user ID that's being edited, then yes, we want that to happen as well. So if you are that person, you can disable yourself, or if you are the administrator, you can disable them. And that's all that's required to get this working. So let's have a look at that. We now see I'm making a change to myself. That's okay. I can add a user. Let's add user 1 or user 1, and then we go 111, 111. Actually, that might collide. So we might just say user 2. And now notice what's happening when we're trying to add a user. The active field doesn't have a default value. So it's asking us, well, the application is always going to have to assign a default value if you don't assign one yourself. So let's go into the add, and sorry, I've got to go up, add method here. And interestingly enough, patch entity and the accessible fields property is only for when you take an array in and you're trying to patch an entity with it, or you're creating a new entity out of patched data. But what we're trying to do here is we're going to just say, okay, no matter what, after you've patched the entity, I want you to set the active property to true. And so now, will that work if we try that again? So let's try user 2 and 222 and 222 and submit. And yes, it does. So now we're currently logged in as administrator, and we can edit that user. Let's create another user again, and this time will be 333. And now let's log out and log in as user 33. And now we're logged in, as we can see. Let's have a look at our session. We can see the logged in user stored here. We're user 3. And now I'm going to try and make a change to that active property for that other user. Can't do it. Try the same with my admin user and can't do it. But of course I can set active to false for user 3 and again set it back there. So now we've given ourselves the ability to mark users active and also provided a little bit of a check to make sure they can't disable other users. However, where are we up to? Well, currently, let's look at logging in as user 2 and notice what happens when we log in as user 2. Well, it says active is no, but it's still enabled us to log in as user 2. So what we're going to do is go into our application SRC file. So go SRC application here and start to look at what we need to do to make sure that this active users are the only ones who can log in. If we go to our documentation, so looking at, if we go to the Cake authentication tutorial on the web, so you'll find that easy. You look here under the authentication and you'll find that it says there's a link to the Cake Authentication Plugin documentation. Now go to identifiers. So how are we identifying who can sign in? And notice here that underneath this loading the identifier, the password identifier, it has an array here of resolver defaults, or actually its default is all, but a resolver with a finder method called active. So let's copy all this and put it into our configuration underneath authentication password. And we won't actually do that. It's a good idea to, if you're going to use something multiple times, obviously, to use the ability just to sort of declare it once. So we're going to put resolver as this here, and we've now got a different method to find users. Before it is using all, and now we're using active. Let's assign that now to the resolver key, so that resolver array gets assigned there. So now what's going to happen when we log out and attempt to log back in? Well, because we've configured it to use the active finder and that doesn't currently exist, we need to go to the users table and create that. So go into model table users under the src directory. It's underneath maybe the initialize method. We're going to use some of VSCode's auto completion here. So I'm just going to say find, and then the auto completion of all the cake PHP methods here gives us a find all. So if we click or press enter on that when we select it, it will auto-complete the definition that we need to insert, and then all I need to do is just specify it's the active finder. Now if we just say to ourselves, okay, I'm just going to return the query unchanged, and we then go to log in, we're back to exactly the default, which is anyone can log in. And you notice here we've got an inactive user who's just logged in as then. So now we just need to now create a where clause and say active equals true. So just give me, if you're going to identify users, just give me the ones who are active. So let's log out again and try and log back in, and now we can see that our inactive user cannot log in, but our admin user who is active can. So that's pretty good. Now we've got the other thing to look at. Now if we don't make this change, the defaults for the load identifier for authentication token mean that we'll still enable everybody, even if they're inactive, to authenticate via token authentication. So just for testing purposes, we're going to uncomment and allow submitting tokens via a request. Now that's not a good idea. Generally it's a good idea to embed the authentication token in a header, and obviously you'll be tunneling across the internet with SSL, and so your tokens will be protected. But this query param just exposes the token on the URL, so in the location bar, and it's visible to everyone. But we'll just uncomment that for the moment, and notice we've got 111, 222 and 333. Let's just try and connect, and we've first of all got to log out, so we're going to try and connect as that second user, which is 222. So we're going to say token equals 222, and notice how it allows us in. We know we're not using session authentication because there is no user in the session. We're simply using token auth, but it's allowing us in. So let's now fix that. So we go into here and we just copy from our password resolver into our token identifier, and now let's have a look at the result of that. So we just go press again, and you can see that it's saying can't do that. Now if we go again with maybe the 333 user, which is the one that's still active, we can see that it's allowing us in despite the fact that there's no session based authentication working there at all. So we've gotten to the point now where our token authentication is working, but I thought we'd just do something that would help us to look at a really helpful cakephp developer plugin that would help us around some issues that you run into quite regularly. And we're going to demonstrate that using this different way of configuring the resolver. So we've just used the array method, which is just passing it in the configuration array. Now we're going to look at this style using set resolver. So we're not going to use a custom resolver, we're just going to use the standard resolver, but we're going to configure it in this with using set resolver. So firstly we need to say, okay, resolver equals, we're going to new up. Now the default resolver is the ORM resolver. So that's the resolver that gets used to query the database. And as you can see, it queries the user's model, and then the default finder is all, but we're changing it to be the active finder. So just so you know how arbitrary this is, find so we're going to change the name of that, and we'll change this to alright, so changing that to the enabled, and now we're going to do it to our authentication. We're going to comment out our resolver here because we're going to use this set resolver method. And notice the challenge we've got. I'm trying to autocomplete the set resolver method and it is not coming up. Now why is that? Let's investigate together so that you understand my logic behind this. First of all, have a look at load identifier and notice how it's returning us an identifier interface. So if I click on that and have a look, you find that the identifier interface only has identify and get errors, but there's no, and as you can see at the moment, sorry, so look at that, it's auto-completing those fine because it knows about them. But there's no reference to the set resolver method, which the documentation says is there. So what's going on? Well, if we have a look, do it by doing a search, we go into our vendor directory, down to cake authentication here, and we can just do a find in that folder. Look for set resolver, and notice that it's mentioned in the documentation a lot, but it's also mentioned in this resolver aware trait. So where is the resolver aware trait being specified? And so can we tell the editor or the IDE how to resolve these methods by making a change? Let's have a look at the resolver aware trait, and we find out besides itself, it's mentioned in the token identifier class and the password identifier class. So when we want VSCode to know about this method of set resolvers, we need to be able to say, well, authentication password and authentication token refer when we're specifying them as a command line, they refer to these two classes, firstly for password and then for token identifier. So how do we get this to work? Well, here we come to the point where we can leverage the great work of the cakephp developers and things they've released, just so that we can see how exactly we get to the point I was at right there. The Euromark cakephp-ide-helper is the GitHub repository. If we go here and scroll down, then it says, yep, it's got a reference to VSCode there, so it's supported. And then we have a look at the docs, and then we scroll and it says, okay, the first thing you need to do to get a bit of help with this auto-completion is install the IdeHelper. And once you've installed it, you need to load the IdeHelper. But notice it's saying it should be used for local development and included in a try-catch and only for CLI. So if we look at the application PHP file to the bootstrap method here, and then we just cast our eyes to this line here and then run the command, we can see that by default this load helper command will be put in the wrong place. So we just cut that out, go down to our bootstrap CLI method, so this is for exactly what they're asking for, put in a try-catch here, and then paste the call to add plugin in here, so that satisfies the installation requirements. Now, there's a heck of a lot of stuff in here and I don't really understand what it all does, but what I am wanting to do is to tell VS Code about all the hints it needs to develop in cakephp. So it doesn't say VS Code here, but this works. So go into bin cake and use this command here, and then what we'll do, we'll collapse our tree here, and then just look up the top here as I run the command up on the left, and notice what it's done. When we run it, it creates a PHP Storm meta directory and an IdeHelper file, and in this file there's thousands of lines of suggestions for the IDE to make better decisions when it's developing in cakephp. So what we're going to do is we're going to search for a command called an override, and I'm just going to copy this block of code, go to the bottom of the page and paste it in, and now we're going to go back into our application PHP file and go to where we're having the problem, and we're going to see that we need to specify this. So we've got that, we need to specify that within this IdeHelper. So that's what we're going to tell it about. So we can do this by going authentication, and then it was the authentication service, wasn't it? And then we just say, okay, the method that we're interested in is load identifier, and look at the first string argument there, the 0th argument, which is name, and from here we can say, okay, let's take authentication dot password and put it here, and then we need to tell our editor we've got authentication. Now it's an identifier that we're looking for, and the identifier for this one is the password identifier. So now we can do that fully qualified, and then exactly the same thing for our authentication token. Now before we make that change to the other one, notice now that what we're getting when we have a look here, we now got the option to set a resolver and it auto completes for us, and we can specify that newed up resolver that we've already created. So again, if you look here, you can see that we've still got the same problem. So we go back into the helper here. Before we do that, we need to copy the token argument there so it knows what it's looking at, and then just say, okay, again, authentication identifier, and it's the token identifier, and give us the full name of the class when you do this lookup. So now we have really useful code completion using the IdeHelper created by Euromark. I think that's how you say it. Let me know if it's not. So where are we at with that? Well, let's do our testing now. So, oops, clicked the wrong thing. Let's do our testing with, we know that 222, so currently is anyone logged in? No one's logged in, so we're using token authentication. Let's use a disabled user here. I'll just copy that so that we, right, so disabled user doesn't let them in. An enabled user is fine, and again, another enabled user is good. So really, that's how we go about sorting out token authentication and those sorts of things. Just one final thing that I thought we could look at is in our, and you'll find this a lot, if you're doing some unauthenticated methods and some authenticated methods. So by that I mean, if in our controller, in our before filter, we add unauthenticated actions here. So here's login and add as unauthenticated. So what potentially can happen, and we're just going to simulate a problem here, is I'm just going to go to my edit and grab this. So I've forgotten that this particular method, it might sometimes have an authenticated user and other times it might not, and that happens a lot. So let's hit the new user button, and notice what we're getting. It's call to a member function get identifier on null. And what you can do with this, especially with PHP 8 and above, I believe, I'm not exactly sure which versions, you can just specify that that might be null. And I think from that point, it will always return, if we have a look, it'll return null. And then you'll save yourself a headache of doing this sort of stuff. It's throwing an error. So I think that pretty much covers a few of the things that you might go through and hit when you're looking at modifying your authentication code and those sorts of things, especially those editor tips. I really hope that they're helpful to someone.